It's Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, where we provide tailor-made solutions for long-term ventilated adults and children with tracheostomies and otherwise medically complex patients by improving their quality of life, and where we also provide tailor-made solutions to hospitals and intensive care units to save money and resources whilst providing quality care. In last week's blog, I shared an article, Health Services in Crisis. Daughter begs for terminally ill father to have care at home. You can check out last week's episode by clicking on the link below this video. In this week's blog, I want to focus on a study that was published recently on the Medscape website, and the title was When a Loved One is in the ICU, the Symptom Burden of Family Caregivers. A recent article and study confirms that with millions of people being admitted into intensive care every year all over the world, that family caregivers suffer too. Whether it's the uncertainty of survival for their loved one whilst they are in intensive care, or if it's the uncertainty of what the future holds for their loved one, the burden on a family or a family caregiver cannot be underestimated. We at Intensive Care at Home certainly know from experience and from our clients that they often have been through many stressful weeks, months, or sometimes even years where their loved ones have been in ICU and therefore their lives stopped. What isn't mentioned in the article below is how much trauma and stress families in intensive care have to go through when their loved ones are long-term patients in ICU for many weeks, many months, or sometimes even many years. It is often taking an emotional, physical, mental, as well as financial toll when families spend day and night in intensive care to be with their loved ones. It's stressful enough having a loved one in intensive care for a few days, let alone having a loved one in intensive care long term. We certainly also know at Intensive Care at Home from experience that taking long-term ICU patients home improves the quality of life for patients and their families, and the psychological stress and trauma is significantly lessened. Therefore, Intensive Care at Home is providing a holistic win-win solution for all stakeholders when it comes to long-term ventilated or otherwise medically complex long-term ICU adults and children. We provide a genuine alternative to a long-term stay in intensive care, and we reduce the cost of an intensive care bed by more than 50%. We also increase the likelihood that families can return back home and return to as much normality as possible, living life in an environment where they want to be, whilst their loved one gets similar care than in an ICU, just in a much more patient and family-friendly environment. You can also read the original article that was published on the Medscape website. I put a link below this video to the article, and if you are watching this on YouTube, please click on the link below this video. That'll get you to our website where you can access the original article. So the title of the original article was When a Loved One is in the ICU, the Symptom Burden of Family Caregivers, from Betty R. Farrell, PhD and RN. The article is from May 2018, and I read it out for you here now. Caregivers have symptoms too. There is a growing recognition of the emotional and physical burdens and distress of family caregivers of seriously ill patients. Symptom assessment is the standard of care for patients in critical care settings, yet the symptom burden of family caregivers is not often addressed. Until now, most of the attention towards symptoms in caregivers has focused on the home environment where family members become the 24-hour daily caregivers. A recent study identified common symptoms experienced by these family caregivers, a necessary first step in alleviating some of this burden. An assessment tool commonly used to assess patient symptoms, the Memorial Symptom Assessment Scale, was used to measure caregiver symptoms. The study also explored the severity of the reported symptoms as well as demographic characteristics associated with symptom burden. The frequency of self-reported symptoms among caregivers was high, a median of 9 symptoms, range 0 to 24. Psychological rather than physical symptoms were at the top of the list. For example, worrying was identified by 91% of caregivers, followed by sadness, 88%, and difficulty concentrating, 74%. The most frequent physical symptoms were difficulty sleeping, a lack of energy, and reduced appetite. The term family-centered care is often used in healthcare, but this study reminds us about how often we ignore the second-order patients known as family caregivers. This study is part of a growing body of literature which challenges us to expand our scope of care to those who may need it the most. This study sheds new light on the experiences of these family caregivers through assessment of their symptoms. As the investigators acknowledge, millions of patients are admitted to intensive care units each year, making this a common area of concern. Often the critical care admission occurs with no warning, and families are suddenly thrust into the highly stressful situation of an ICU and the uncertain survival of their loved ones. As might be expected, many of the caregiver symptoms were psychological in nature, but physical symptoms were also prevalent. The findings also identified those family caregivers with the greatest symptom burden and distress. Younger caregivers, spouses, and those with illnesses of their own to cope with. So this was the article. If you want to find out how we can help you to get your loved one out of the intensive care unit, including palliative care or long-term acute care, or also nursing home, or if you find that you have insufficient support for your loved one at home on a ventilator or with other medical complexities, or if you want to know how to get funding for our service, or if you have any questions, please send me an email to patrick@intensivecareathome.com or call any of the numbers on the top of the website. Please also have a look at our career section for ICU and pediatric ICU nurses for clients in the Melbourne metropolitan area and in South Gippsland, Victoria. We are an NDIS, TAC, and DVA approved community service provider in Australia. We have also been part of the Royal Melbourne Health Accelerator Program for Innovative Healthcare Companies last year. Thank you for tuning into this week's blog. This is Patrick Hutzel from Intensive Care at Home, and I'll see you again next week in another update.